Thank you everybody so much for being here today as part of this ICSA webinar series on Meet the Authors. We're very excited to be interviewing authors in the field of cultic studies or in related disciplines. And it is such a pleasure to welcome Alexandra Stein to this interview today with Joseph Szimhart. Her book that we'll be discussing today is Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, Attachment in Cultic and Totalitarian Systems. So with that being said, Alexandra, I'm really excited to hear about your book, what made you get into this project, and to learn from you today. Thank you so much, Joe, for conducting this interview. And at this time, I'll pass it on to you.
Okay, thank you, Ashlyn. Hello, Alexandra. Good to meet you.
Hi.
And, I'm from here in Philadelphia. You're in London, just so the audience knows. We're doing this Zoom meeting about your book. So let's get started. Why don't you introduce it, why you picked the title, and how you got into writing about this topic. Let us know a little bit about that. Thank you.
Okay, first I want to just slightly correct the title and I'll show the book. Sorry, it's got all my notes on it. Oops. It's Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, Attachment in Cults and Totalitarian System. And the title, I picked it obviously very carefully. I guess the important thing first is the words terror and love at the beginning. That's the essence of what I'm talking about in the book, is the dynamic between that happens in cults and totalitarian systems of arousing feelings of terror and of love, or as I say, quote, love, and setting up systems that appear to be loving, whilst being terrifying, and how those lead to, those are the essence of creating a environment in which brainwashing can take place. And I very purposefully use the word brainwashing because I think it's one that lay people have a gut understanding that it means someone's controlling somebody else unethically. Yeah. And I use the word cults because for the same reason, or cult, that lay people have a gut understanding that that's a group that's unethical and controlling of other people. Okay. And it relates to totalitarian systems, as this happens also in statewide environments, not just in groups.
Alexandra, was there any particular group or movement or groups that stimulated you to write this? I mean, how did you encounter this experientially? I mean, what was the stimulus for writing it?
Well, I certainly didn't have a childhood thinking when I grow up, I want to write about cults. I don't know anyone who does, unless they grew up in one. And of course, but I did myself belong to a cult from the ages of 26 to 36 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And that's documented in my first book, which is a memoir called Inside Out.
Inside Out, right.
My nice, pretty cover that my late friend Janice painted. I hope that shows, I think, getting the cult experience is rather a gray one. And when you come out, you see color again. Okay. So that's why I like that cover. Anyway, yeah, so I was in this, what was a political group. It was a so-called left-wing group, which wasn't really, because it didn't do anything that I consider left-wing or for social justice, but it did oppress and control its members. And so when I got out of that, I was just kind of gobsmacked, like how had a intelligent, independent, clever person like me wound up in such a situation where I was allowing this group the leader via the group to tell me to do things that I never would have done otherwise. And so I set out to try to answer that question. And I've spent the last 30 years, I suppose, like yourself. I think you've got a few more.
I'm guilty of that too, yeah.
Yeah, so that's how a lot of us come to this field of study, right? And
Yes.
that was how I came to it. And then ended up going to university rather late in life and getting a PhD studying this. And then after that, writing Terror, Love, and Brainwashing.
Okay. And what was the concentration for your PhD dissertation or thesis?
When you say, do you mean the discipline?
Well, you said you got a PhD. What was the concentration or topic for that PhD?
Oh, well, I did a comparative study between two political, well, again, so-called. When you're talking about cults, you often have to say so-called because they have a fiction about themselves. But there was a New York-based group called the Newman Tendency, run by a guy called Fred Newman, that was a political group, but it was also a therapy group, and it also had theater as one of its things it did. But it was supposedly a left-wing political grouping, but it was a cult. And so my study was comparing that to the Green Party, which I consider not to be a cult. And I did, it's complicated to explain, but I did an in-depth study with using many different methods, and part of which was interviewing ex-members of both groups. And to cut a very long story short, finding that the ex-members of the Newman Tendency all had some kind of trauma, and the way they spoke about the group indicated trauma, whereas ex-members of the Green Party just spoke about it like, well, I was in that and now I'm not in it anymore, but I still have friends there. Yeah. There was no trauma there because it was not a cult. It was not a traumatic experience. So I wanted to highlight
I think
that difference.
Yeah, I think one of the tendencies that totalist cults have is to make the exit process very difficult, mostly psychologically. Something's going to happen to you, or you're going to be vilified, or you will become an enemy. But you don't get that in, quote, normal groups like the Green Party. If you want to leave and switch to some other party, they say, good luck, sorry to see you go, and that's about it.
And you may be a little annoyed. You may, you'll leave, maybe because you have differences, maybe because you just want to do something else. But yeah, it won't be, generally speaking, a fear-filled, terrifying process, which I think nearly everyone who's left a cult, it's a terrifying process. Sometimes it is physically terrifying. In my case, the leader, by the time I left, I didn't know this when I was in it, but as I was leaving, I discovered he had actually killed somebody. And so then there was a lot of physical fear. Luckily, there wasn't any physical repercussion, but the fear was there. And I think for a lot of people, there is a real fear. As we know, there are many cults that do come after members physically, let's say.
Yeah, like the mafia.
But of course, many don't. And then, as you say, it's a psychological, what I kind of call an existential fear, because it's very difficult for people to name it. It's just a feeling of fear that's almost just in the body, and they can't really name it. So it's often helpful to say that it's a nameless dread.
Yes, it's a form of dread. I know the group I left, one of them said that I would suffer 10,000 lifetimes of hell on earth, reincarnating for betraying the cause. That was one of the things. So
I think
I had a long way to go.
Yeah, I call these parting curses. Yes. I think I was told, you're going to become a prostitute or a drug addict or an agent of the state, which in our group was a very bad thing to be.
Oh,
so
horrible. Yeah.
I didn't.
Well, could you?
Spoiler alert.
Could you describe the book? Where the contents of it. What are the main themes in the book?
Well, I use something that's called attachment theory, which is a theory from a British psychiatrist, John Bowlby, that I don't think I'll explain now because it may take a little bit too long. But it's really helpful and really intuitive, and it's an evolutionary based theory that basically does say that we need attachment to others in the same way that we need food, drink, shelter. It's an evolutionary survival need, which I think we're seeing in this pandemic, you know, how much we need our attachments to others. And the purpose of that attachment is protection. That's the kind of evolutionary purpose, is that if we're not attached to others, we tend not to survive as well. And certainly babies need attachment to others to survive. So it's a really interesting and a useful theory that thousands and thousands of studies have been based on now. Okay. And there's a very damaging form of attachment where it's very unhealthy, called disorganized attachment, which we can think about as a trauma bond, where you're bonding to an unhealthy, scary person. And I saw that as being what happens in cults, that people get sort of glued into these groups, not necessarily as a person, but at least the group, as a relationship that's a dangerous relationship to something that's really against that person's own survival needs and is damaging their own survival needs, but is useful to the cult and to the leader. So I kind of use that theory to go through, first to define a cult, and then to go through with a lot of what I hope and think are interesting stories and examples from a great variety of people's experiences. And okay. I look at how cults are structured, how the belief systems reflect this dynamic, and how that, well, I guess that goes back to the terror and love idea, that if you have those two forces going on, that kind of is the essence of the trauma bond. So you've
okay. Yeah, it's almost like the carrot and the stick a motif in a way.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is. But if the really key thing I'm trying to get across is this only works if you're isolated from any other attachments. So
now, when you say isolated, do you mean psychologically isolated or
well,
physically?
I mean, psychologically and socially. Now, I don't mean physically, but I do mean socially, which is a bit of a different thing than physically. So you don't have to be locked in a compound in the middle of the desert, although we know some cults operate like that. You know, in my group, I was going to work every day at a large corporation, but I even sort of made a few friends at work, but they never came to my home. I didn't go to their homes. They didn't know I had this whole other life where I did another full-time job without pay, of course, as my second shift every day. So I had these two very separate lives, and the life that was dominant was the cult life. So I wasn't, you know, that was the isolation. So cults have to isolate you in order for this terror and love dynamic to result in control over the follower. So I try to look at that. So in short, my kind of shortest current formula for this is isolation plus engulfment in a system that you perceive to be safe, even though it's not, plus chronic arousal of stress and fear results in a controllable and exploitable follower.
Okay, interesting.
So isolation plus engulfment plus fear.
Okay. Yeah, I think the group I was in, I noticed that they were always doing crisis management. There was always manufactured crises, you know, that happened, and people had to work harder or get more money or whatever. So, but I get what you're saying. That's now in terms of recovery from that kind of abuse or brainwashing, we'll call it. Do you address that in the book and how people manage to recover or exit from it?
I do a little bit. I should mention that the second edition of this book is coming out in the beginning of 2021. And I have a slightly expanded section on recovery because I haven't got a lot of that. I've got some. And I think, you know, when you're in a cult, you have this, you know, all your close relationships are cut off. Even within the cult, you can't really have trusting relationships. In fact, you really can't have trusting relationships. I'll change the emphasis there. So when you get out, you have to understand what happened in the cult, because also in the cult dissociates you. It prevents you thinking about what you're actually experiencing. And indeed, the cult then tells you what you're experiencing with its fictional account of what's happening. So instead of you going, I feel exhausted and unhappy because I'm not allowed to be close to anybody and I'm working 18 hours a day, the cult is telling you you're not working hard enough and you're not satisfied because you're not trying hard enough, you know, that, or whatever their account is. So
yeah,
when you get out, you have to understand, what is a cult? How does it work? What was that fiction? What was your actual experience? And in a way, you have to tell back the story to yourself. You have to go back through all those years and look at them with your own eyes rather than with the cult's narrative, and evaluate what was actually happening. So that's the kind of what we call in the attachment world, creating a coherent narrative based on real experience. Then, of course, you have to learn how to relate to people again. So there's also there's that emotional side of rebuilding relationships. Let's not forget all the practical things that you need in recovery, because you need to rebuild often your job, you know, have a new job, maybe new housing. So there's, I mean, recovery is a really, really complex and comprehensive process. And I'm maybe only touching on a few of the things, but I think the key thing is understanding the reality of your experience and not the cultic fiction, and rebuilding trusting relationships and learning how to do that.
Yeah,
very challenging, very difficult.
Yeah, it is, and I guess you from what you're saying, it's quite individualistic also. Some people, at least in my experience, seem to recover rather seemingly easily. They seamlessly get back into society with some anxious nights or whatever, and then other people are emotional wrecks for a while. They have a hard time grappling with it. Can you talk about the difference between someone that leaves one of these totalitarian groups more easily and those that struggle with it? What would be the difference, do you think?
People enter cults or find themselves in cults by a variety of means. They don't all enter them in the same way. Like, some are born into them, right? Some are press ganged, kidnapped, like Patty Hearst. Some, more like me, sort of go looking to join a group in a very deliberate way. So we come into cults in a variety of ways. We leave cults in a variety of ways as well, with a variety of outcomes. The experience in a cult always looks remarkably similar. In leaving, I think you have some people who dig into the experience and try to understand it, like you or I, who've taken that to rather an extreme, shall we say, and others who do some of that. You have some who leave and never look back. I know people from my cult like that. They just carry on like those 20 years had no meaning, you know, are gone, and they may never really talk about it.
Okay.
And some of them may have perfectly functional lives. That may not be the way I think you should recover. And we tend to think some of those people may be rather prone to some cult hopping. Yeah. But not all. Some can have okay lives, some can cult hop. So I've learned over time not to be quite so judgmental about what people have to do in order to carry on with life. What my recovery may not suit someone else, even though I think they may not be as clued in as I am or whatever, you know, but nonetheless, they're doing okay.
Yeah, I think, what do you think of this? People enter these groups obviously with a type of character or personality. Everyone carries that with them throughout their lives. And there's some people that tend to be shy, some people that tend to be more acquisitive, inquisitive, you know, and strive for education, and other people seem to be fantasy prone. And I've noticed that in exiting some individuals, they remain somewhat fantasy prone after leaving the group, exploring other things, what you called cult hopping, but maybe, you know, something that satisfies that agenda. For instance, I can think of a few people that the group was into conspiracies, and then they left the group thinking it was a cult and brainwashing, and then they still were entertaining conspiracies 20 years later when they contacted me. So I don't know. I don't have an answer for all of that, but it seems that personality and character have a lot to do with how people recover.
Well, I think it does, but I also think access to resources has a huge amount, because as we know, there's very little access to resources when you get out of a cult. I mean, how many cult experienced counselors are there on the planet? Not many, right? I mean, I've ended up doing post-cult recovery counselor. I'm not a trained therapist, but I've done it because there's an absolute lack of it. And this is, you know, one of the reasons I wrote my book is because not only is there a lack of trained therapists, there's a lack of any public general informed understanding. And there's a lack of language by which to describe these experiences. And, you know, I know this is one of my serious problems in the field, is that there has been an attack on the language that we try to use. Words such as cult and brainwashing, which have become in certain quarters seen as controversial, which I think is absurd, because without language, you're entering a realm of Orwell's 1984, where you cannot describe a phenomena. And these are very specific phenomena. It's the only reason I'm speaking to you right now, who was in a cult that was utterly different than mine, right? We wouldn't know each other if it was not that we were linked by this very particular phenomena that has to have a name. And the fact that even in our own field, there's discussion and controversy about giving this phenomena a name, makes it very hard for people who get out of these groups to understand what's happened to them. So I think, yes, there's personality. You know, I was shy before I got in the group. I may not look it, but I'm still shy. You know, I'm a shy person. I can be socially awkward in groups. You know, I'm still that person. But I was also an intelligent and productive person, and that's why the cult liked me. And those are the people cults tend to hang on to.
Yeah, I think that, I think it was Lifton, I'm not sure, called them deployable agents. Or pawns in the game. They could be moved around, and they were happy moving around. Yeah.
And if they're no use to you, you don't really want them hanging around. You know, cults don't tend to look after the sick and the maimed for very long. They get rid of them. So I get a little worried about the personality stuff. I mean, I do think there is some place for looking at personality. Like, I think some people who are psychologically lend themselves to being bullies may rise higher in the ranks in a cult and become some of the higher lieutenants, although you see non-bullies in those ranks too sometimes. So you have to be a bit careful about generalizations, I think. And I think, yes, when people come out, you know, my personality is I am intellectually curious and studious. And so, you know, I like to answer the questions I have, and I like to write, and I like to teach, and that's what I've ended up doing. So it just happens
Okay.
my topic ended up being cults, you know, where others
Yeah.
may want to go into, you know, banking or something that they were previously interested in.
Now, you've probably noticed, like all of us in the field, that there's been a tremendous media interest in the cult phenomenon in the last 5, maybe 10 years, with Netflix and that kind of programming, doing lots of series on cults, the Oxygen Channel, for instance, and A&E with the Scientology series. These were very popular, and I'm just wondering, is this a form of voyeurism that people enjoy watching this sort of thing, in the sense that, you know, that's not me, how can those people fall into that? And is it also voyeurism that they're fascinated how intelligent people can get caught up in this? I mean, how do you address this phenomena of interest in this, and are you frustrated with how it's being defined in the media, or are you happy with it?
Oh, I'm certainly frustrated mostly, though I think it's slightly improving.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely there's massive voyeurism. On the other hand, sometimes I get surprised. I was talking to a colleague, not just this week actually, who was talking about the Wild Wild Country, you know, that was on Netflix.
I saw that.
Massively successful. I didn't actually see it, but I heard that it was problematic and missed really key elements about the leader and so forth. So anyway, and he was saying at the time he was in a cult when he watched it, and that's what clued him in, that the group he was in was problematic. And from there, he went and did his research, and now he's, you know, learned a lot about cults.
Yeah, so it helped him. Wild Wild Country, I thought, was well done because it was done a specific way. It didn't have a narrator. It let the interviews on real time in the news and in the 3 main characters they interviewed tell the story, and not have a narrator do it. And also there were 3 points of view in it, which is, I think, maybe some people saw one of the points of view which was less critical of the group, and other point of view was more critical. So they allowed all these points of view to weave in and out of the whole story. I watched it straight through for 6 hours. I thought it was good. Anyway, yeah.
So, I mean, what I would, you know, I think, like, I just watched Seduced, which has, of course, Janja Lalich,
Yes.
wonderful colleague, and Steve Hassan and Rick Ross. And I was pleased with that because they had not enough, in my view, but more of what I would refer to as an analytical framework. And that's what I want to see a lot more of, is, you know, all these stories are dramatic. A cult story is by its nature dramatic. Although I have to say, living in a cult is often very boring, but the stories are dramatic. So you have a ready-made story there, which is, I'm sure, a lot of why the fascination and the media interest. You know, it's human tragedy, you know, big time, right?
Yeah.
But without an analytical framework to point out to people, this is what you're seeing, this is the danger point, these are the warning signs, etc. That's when it's voyeuristic, in my view. You need to help people understand what this phenomena is, which again is what I tried to do in my book by using stories, but with a, in my case, heavy on the analytical framework. In a media thing, you would obviously be heavier on the stories. But I think both have to go together to educate people. However, I think the fact that there has been more media interest has to be helping in the long run, because there's more conversation about it.
Okay.
And that's good.
Let's get.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Let's get back to your book. Why don't we do a reading from it now before we run out of time? I appreciate you picking something to read to the audience.
Okay, I just actually thought I'd cut, you know, and not have people be in suspense and just read the very end.
Oh.
So, they don't have to read the book, they've just got the end here. So
that's like telling a punchline without the joke. Don't do that.
Well, I'm going to. So And the first two people I mentioned were people I had either interviewed or knew who were ex-cult members. In this case, political cult members like myself. Marina Ortiz, Masoud Bonisada, and myself were young and intelligent when we were recruited. All three of us wanted to help build a more equal and fair world. Others like us were simply on our way to a variety of goals: to get help through therapy, to grow spiritually, to get involved in theater, to take fitness classes, or to be involved in a positive way in politics or religion. We did not set about looking for an unhappy, powerless tenure in dangerous organizations where later our children came to be at risk. And these children did not join these organizations, but grew up in them. They certainly had no choice. But it is not a choice for anyone when totalist groups obscure their actual methods and goals beneath layers of deception and coercion. Had we known that we would become isolated, engulfed in a secretive world, and subjected to an unpredictable seesaw of terror and love, well, that knowledge would have saved us from wasted, frightening, and dangerous years, from being recruited by accident on our way to other aims, much as the young terrorist recruits of today are psychologically coerced into lives that they do not understand. Indeed, we were young and intelligent, and with preventive education, we could have recognized and resisted these dangerous relationships. I think I'll stop there.
Murray, thank you.
Education is the prevention. So
Okay.
we need more.
You know, you bring that up. I remember during the 9/11 attack on New York, they were interviewing people in Cairo, and a reporter asked a Cairo college student, "What's going to stop these radicals? How do you stop this from happening?" And the student answered with just one word: education. It was interesting.
Yeah, and if I just want to slightly clarify that, because I don't want to be misunderstood. When I say education, I don't mean general education, though that's obviously a good thing. I mean education about the methods and mechanics of how cults and totalitarian systems operate. And again, for that, we need a language and knowledge and a clear definition of how this works. And I think we are pretty good now that we understand how it works. And it's our job to be clear and unapologetic about that. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. We'll leave it at that. I think we've run out of time. I appreciate you participating in this series, and thank you, and good luck with your new edition of the book.
Thanks.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, Joe. Good to talk to you.
Same here.